The blazing sun hung like a gold coin in the Texas sky as Nathaniel Tucker reined his stallion to a halt at the edge of Abilene, dust settling around him like memories he couldn't shake. The year was 1871, and the railroad had transformed this once quiet cattle town into a bustling hub of commerce and sin in equal measure. Nathaniel Nate, to the few who claimed friendship, adjusted his worn leather hat and surveyed the town through narrowed eyes. 3 years since he'd last set foot here, 3 years since they'd run him out with accusations on their lips and hatred in their eyes. They called you a liar then, and they'll call you one now, he muttered to himself, patting his horse's sweat-dampened neck. Difference is, this time they're right. The truth had become a luxury he couldn't afford, not after what happened at the Brazos River, not after what he'd done. But Abilene held something worth the risk of return, his brother's final resting place, an unfinished business that gnawed at him like a coyote with a bone. Nate guided his horse down the main thoroughfare, ignoring the sideways glances from townsfolk who recognized him despite his now bearded face and the scar that cut across his left cheek. Wooden buildings lined both sides of the street, some freshly painted, others weathered by sun and prairie winds. The White Elephant Saloon stood exactly as he remembered, its swinging doors parting to release a piano's tinny melody and the familiar cacophony of gambling men and working women. He dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post. His boots hit the dirt with a thud that seemed to echo his heartbeat. 3 years of drifting, taking odd jobs as a ranch hand or scout, living on the edges of civilization, and here he was, back where it all went wrong. "Well, I'll be damned," came a voice from the store's porch. "If it ain't lying Nate Tucker, bold as brass and twice as foolish." Sheriff Morris Blackfield stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, a man whose authority came more from his willingness to use his gun than from any moral standing. He'd been newly appointed when Nate left town, and the badge hadn't improved his disposition. "Sheriff," Nate acknowledged with a tip of his hat, "I'm not here for trouble." "Trouble follows you like a shadow, Tucker. What brings you back to Abilene when you know full well what folks think of you?" "My brother's grave needs tending," Nate replied simply. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. The sheriff spat tobacco juice into the street. "See to your business and move on. One whiff of trouble, and I'll have you in irons faster than you can spin one of your tall tales." Nate nodded and pushed past him into the store. The bell above the door announced his arrival, and the shopkeeper, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. "What can I?" His words trailed off as recognition dawned. "Nathaniel Tucker. Didn't think we'd see you in these parts again." "Just need supplies, Mr. Perkins, then I'll be on my way." The storekeeper's eyes narrowed. "Money's still good." Nate placed a few coins on the counter. "Gold doesn't tarnish, even when a man's reputation does." Mr. Perkins gathered the items. Nate requested coffee, bacon, beans, ammunition for his Colt, moving with deliberate slowness, as if expecting Nate to steal something the moment his back was turned. As Nate waited, a young woman entered the store. She wore a simple blue dress, practical for the frontier but somehow elegant on her slender frame. Her honey-brown hair was pinned up beneath a modest bonnet, and she carried a wicker basket over one arm. "Good morning, Mr. Perkins," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I've come for those medical supplies Dr. Thompson ordered." "Of course, Miss Dawson. I've got them set aside, just finishing with this customer." Perkins gestured toward Nate with barely concealed disdain. The woman turned, and Nate found himself looking into intelligent hazel eyes that assessed him with neither fear nor judgment, just curiosity. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "I'm Deanna Dawson. I assist Dr. Thompson at the clinic." Nate removed his hat, suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance. "Nathaniel Tucker, madam, just passing through." A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Tucker? Are you related to Samuel Tucker by chance?" The mention of his brother's name hit Nate like a physical blow. He was my brother, died 3 years back, her expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. I arrived in Abilene only 2 years ago, but I've heard his name mentioned. He was a well-respected man. Yes, madam, he was. Unlike me, Nate thought bitterly. Mr. Perkins cleared his throat. Your supplies, Miss Dawson. He placed a package wrapped in brown paper on the counter, pointedly turning his back on Nate. Thank you. She paid for her items and then turned back to Nate. Mr. Tucker, if you're in town for any length of time, the clinic is always in need of able-bodied men to help with various tasks. Dr. Thompson isn't as young as he once was. Nate was taken aback by the offer. That's kind, but I don't expect a warm welcome in Abilene. She tilted her head slightly. Everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Tucker. With a nod, she departed, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender and an impression that lingered like the afterglow of lightning. Mr. Perkins pushed Nate's purchases across the counter. Don't you go bothering Miss Dawson. She's a lady of quality and doesn't know about your kind. My kind, Nate said, his voice dangerously quiet. Liars and troublemakers. The kind that got their own brother killed with tall tales and schemes. Nate's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but he forced it back to his side. You don't know what you're talking about, Perkins. Everyone knows, Tucker, how you lied about that silver strike and got your brother and 3 other men killed by the Comanche. How you were the only one who made it back alive. Perkins leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper. Some say you led them into that ambush on purpose, that you were working with the raiders to split whatever they could steal. Nate gathered his supplies with rigid movements. You best stop talking now. Truth hurts, don't it? Perkins sneered. Nate left without another word, the bell jangling angrily behind him. Outside, he loaded his supplies into his saddlebags with shaking hands. The accusations weren't new, but they still cut deep, especially because there was a grain of truth buried within them just enough to make the guilt unbearable. He'd claimed to have found silver, that much was true. But it wasn't a lie, he genuinely believed he'd struck it rich. The Comanche attack had been unexpected, brutal. He'd survived by pure luck, thrown from his horse into a ravine while the others were caught in the open. By the time he'd climbed out, it was too late. He'd found his brother dying, an arrow in his chest. Sam's last words haunted him still. Find the truth, Nate. Something ain't right about this. Nate mounted his horse and headed toward the cemetery on the outskirts of town. The modest plot was well maintained, with wooden crosses and a few stone markers dotting the prairie grass. He found Sam's grave easily enough, a simple wooden cross with his name and dates carved into it. Kneeling beside it, he removed his hat. I came back, Sam, like I promised. I'm going to find out what really happened that day. Someone wanted us to find that worthless mine. Someone wanted us dead. The wind whispered through the grass, the only answer to his vow. Unusual place for a reunion, came a female voice behind him. Nate turned to find Deanna Dawson standing a few yards away, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. The late afternoon sun lit her face with a golden glow. Miss Dawson, he acknowledged, rising to his feet. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I come here every week to place flowers on the unmarked graves, she explained. Not everyone has family to remember them. She moved to a simple cross with no name and placed a few of the flowers at its base. Nate watched her methodical movements as she visited several such graves, dividing her bouquet among them. That's a kindness not many would think to show, he said when she'd finished. Deanna brushed her hands on her skirt. My father was a doctor during the war. He taught me that every life deserves dignity even after death. She glanced at Sam's grave. Your brother was young. 32, Nate said, too young to die for nothing. People in town say different things about how he died, about your part in it. Nate's jaw tightened. People talk too much about things they don't understand. Is that why they call you a liar? The question was direct but delivered without accusation, simply curiosity. They call me that because it's easier than admitting they don't know what happened. Nate placed his hat back on his head, and because they're right. Deanna studied him with those perceptive hazel eyes. Then start telling me the truth. Her boldness surprised a laugh out of him. Miss Dawson, we barely know each other. Sometimes it's easier to speak honestly with a stranger. She gestured to a bench near the cemetery's edge. I have time before I need to return to the clinic. Against his better judgment, Nate followed her to the bench. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. I led my brother and 3 other men to what I thought was a silver deposit in Comanche territory, Nate began. We were attacked. I survived, they didn't. When I came back to town with the bodies and no silver, people decided I'd made up the strike to lure them out there for some nefarious purpose. Did you make it up? Deanna asked. No. I found silver samples exactly where a man named Ellis Fordham said they'd be. Turned out the samples were planted. The mine was worthless. Nate clenched his fists. But I lied about other things. I let people believe I fought bravely, that I tried to save the others. Truth is, I was thrown into a ravine when my horse was spooked. I lay there, hidden, listening to my friends and my brother die, too afraid to move. The confession left him feeling hollow. He'd never spoken those words aloud before. Diana was quiet for a long moment. Fear doesn't make you a liar, Mr. Tucker, it makes you human. My cowardice got them killed. If you had revealed yourself, would it have saved them? Or would there simply have been one more body to bury? Her logic was as direct as her gaze. You said the samples were planted. By whom? That's what I came back to find out. Fordham disappeared right after the attack, never came back to town. Nate looked out over the prairie. Sam's last words were about finding the truth, said something wasn't right. And you believe someone deliberately set you all up to die. Deanna's voice held no skepticism, just thoughtful consideration. I do. The Comanche don't usually venture that far east, especially not in such small numbers. It was like they were waiting for us. Deanna nodded slowly. I may be able to help you, Mr. Tucker. Working with the doctor, I hear things. People talk freely around a woman they consider merely a nurse or assistant. Nate turned to her in surprise. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I know enough. She stood, smoothing her skirt. I believe in justice, Mr. Tucker. If someone orchestrated your brother's death, they should answer for it. She started to walk away, then paused. The livery stable owner, Mr. Dawkins, was friends with your brother. You might start there. Nate watched her retreating figure, bewildered by the encounter. Deanna Dawson was unlike any woman he'd met, direct, intelligent, and seemingly unafraid to involve herself in potentially dangerous matters. He remained at the cemetery until the sun disappeared behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the graves. As darkness fell, he whispered a final promise to his brother's memory, then mounted his horse and rode toward the outskirts of town, where he'd made a simple camp by a creek. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams filled with fragmented memories of the ambush and Sam's dying words. He woke before dawn, the cool morning air clearing his head. Today, he would begin his search for answers. The Abilene livery stable was already busy when Nate arrived. Gus Dawkins, a bear of a man with a graying beard and capable hands, was shoeing a bay mare. He looked up as Nate approached, recognition and wariness crossing his weathered face. Nathaniel Tucker, he said, setting down his tools. Heard you were back in town. News travels fast, Nate observed. Small town. Dawkins wiped his hands on his apron. What can I do for you? Heard you were friends with my brother. Dawkins' expression softened slightly. Sam was a good man, one of the best I knew in these parts. His death was a damn shame. I'm trying to figure out what really happened that day, Nate said. Thought you might know something about Ellis Fordham, the man who told me about the silver. Dawkins' eyes narrowed. Fordham? Yeah, I remember him. Showed up in town maybe a month before you all rode out. Kept to himself mostly, but spent a fair bit of time at the White Elephant. Did Sam know him before the expedition? Don't think so. First I heard of him was when Sam mentioned the trip. Dawkins hesitated. Listen, Tucker, there was talk after you left. Some folks said Fordham was seen with Jerome Blackfield the night before you all rode out. Nate's pulse quickened. The sheriff's brother, the very same. Jerome's got interests in most businesses around here, legitimate and otherwise. If there was something fishy about that expedition, he might know something. Where can I find him? He owns the White Elephant now. Took it over about 2 years back when old man Hargrove died. Dawkins leaned closer. Be careful, Tucker. Jerome's got the sheriff in his pocket and enough hired guns to start a small war. Nate nodded his thanks and turned to leave. Tucker, Dawkins called after him. For what it's worth, Sam never believed you led them into that ambush on purpose. Said you might be fool-headed sometimes, but you weren't no traitor. The words eased something in Nate's chest. Thank you for telling me that. He spent the morning observing the White Elephant Saloon from across the street, trying to get a sense of the operation. Around noon, a well-dressed man arrived in a fine carriage, flanked by 2 armed men. From Dawkins' description, this had to be Jerome Blackfield. Jerome was the sheriff's opposite in appearance, where Morris was burly and rough. Jerome was slim and refined, with a neatly trimmed mustache and expensive clothes. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to power. Nate waited until Jerome had been inside for an hour before approaching the saloon. He pushed through the swinging doors into the dimly lit interior, the smell of whiskey, smoke, and perfume enveloping him. Despite the early hour, the place was half full, with card games in progress and a few working girls circulating among the tables. He ordered a whiskey at the bar, scanning the room until he spotted Jerome at a corner table, going over ledgers with another man. Nate took his time, nursing his drink and waiting for an opportunity to approach. It came sooner than expected when Diana Dawson entered the saloon. Her appearance caused a stir. Respectable women rarely entered such establishments in daylight. She spoke briefly to the barkeep, who pointed toward Jerome's table. Nate watched, intrigued, as Diana approached Jerome with confidence. The businessman rose, greeting her with exaggerated courtesy. They spoke for a few minutes, Jerome's expression shifting from polite interest to something more calculating. When Diana turned to leave, her gaze swept the room and landed on Nate. She gave no sign of recognition but moved toward the exit with purpose. Nate waited a few moments before following her outside. He found her waiting around the corner, partially hidden by a stack of crates. Mr. Tucker, she said quietly, I thought I might find you here. What business do you have with Jerome Blackfield? He asked. Doctor. Thompson treats his wife for nervous exhaustion, which is a polite way of saying she drinks too much and takes too many sleeping powders. Deanna's directness was refreshing. I came to deliver her medicine and take the opportunity to mention your name to gauge his reaction. And he was very interested to hear you've returned to Abilene. Too interested, perhaps. She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. He asked specific questions about where you're staying and how long you plan to remain in town. Nate frowned. That confirms he knows something about what happened. There's more. Last night after we spoke, I checked Dr. Thompson's records from 3 years ago. He treated a man matching Fordham's description the week before your expedition left for a bullet wound in his shoulder. The man claimed it was a hunting accident, but Dr. Thompson noted in his records that the angle suggested otherwise. Someone shot him, Nate considered the implications, or maybe threatened him into setting us up. It seems likely. Deanna looked troubled. Mr. Tucker, I believe you're in danger. If Jerome Blackfield was involved in what happened to your brother, he won't want you asking questions. As if to punctuate her warning, the saloon doors swung open and 2 men emerged, scanning the street with intent. Nate recognized them as Jerome's guards. They're looking for you, Deanna whispered. Nate took her elbow and guided her casually down the alley. We need to separate. I don't want you getting caught up in this. It's too late for that, she replied. Meet me at the clinic after dark, doctor. Thompson is visiting patients at the Watson Ranch tonight. We can talk freely there. Before Nate could protest, she slipped away, emerging onto the main street and walking briskly toward the general store. The two men barely glanced at her, continuing their search in the opposite direction. Nate made his way back to his camp to retrieve his Winchester rifle. If Jerome Blackfield was setting men to look for him, he wanted to be prepared. He spent the afternoon moving his camp deeper into the woods near the creek, where it would be harder to find. As dusk fell, he made his way cautiously back into town. The clinic was a small, whitewashed building on a side street, with a sign reading Dr. E. Thompson, physician and surgeon, hanging above the door. A lamp glowed in the window. Nate approached cautiously, checking for any sign of Jerome's men before knocking softly. Deanna opened the door immediately, as if she'd been waiting just inside. "Come in quickly," she urged. The clinic was neat and surprisingly well equipped for a frontier town. Glass cabinets held medicines and surgical instruments, and a desk in the corner was stacked with medical texts. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Deanna said, motioning for him to take a seat. "About the silver samples being planted, were they actual silver?" Nate nodded. "High-grade ore. I'd worked enough claims to know the real thing. So someone spent considerable money to create a convincing lure." She paced the small room. "The question is, why target your group specifically? What made you valuable or dangerous enough to eliminate?" It was a question Nate had asked himself countless times. Sam was outspoken against some of the business practices in town. He'd testified against a cattle rustling operation the month before, got 3 men sent to prison. But the others, Miller, Davis, and Holt, they were just ordinary men looking to make their fortunes. "Perhaps it wasn't about all of you," Deanna suggested. "Perhaps one of you was the target and the others were collateral damage." The thought made Nate's stomach turn. "If that's true, and if Jerome Blackfield was behind it, he's even colder-blooded than I thought." Deanna stopped pacing, her expression thoughtful. "There's someone else who might know something. Lillian Moore runs the boarding house where Fordham stayed. She keeps meticulous records of her guests and their comings and goings. Would she talk to me? Probably not. She's Jerome's cousin, but she might talk to me." Deanna met his gaze determinedly. "I could visit her tomorrow morning." Nate shook his head. "I appreciate your help, Miss Dawson, but this is getting too dangerous. These men won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. I'm already involved, Mr. Tucker, and I'm careful." She held up a hand to forestall his objection. "Besides, no one would suspect a doctor's assistant of investigating a 3-year-old murder." Before Nate could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Deanna hurried to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. "Sheriff Blackfield and 2 deputies," she whispered. "They're stopping at every building on the street." Nate reached for his gun. "They're looking for me. There's a back door through the surgery." Deanna pointed to a connecting room. "It leads to an alley. Go quickly." Nate hesitated. "If they find out you helped me, they won't." Her confidence was reassuring. "I'll tell them I was preparing medicines for tomorrow's patients." A loud knock at the front door punctuated her words. "Miss Dawson, it's Sheriff Blackfield. Need a word with you." Deanna straightened her apron. "Go," she whispered to Nate. "Meet me at the old mission ruins outside town tomorrow at noon." Nate slipped through the back room as Deanna moved to answer the front door. He paused in the shadows of the alley, listening. "Sheriff," Deanna's voice was calm and professional. "What brings you by so late?" "Looking for a fugitive, Miss Dawson. Nathaniel Tucker. Seen him around, Mr. Tucker?" "Yes, he was at the cemetery yesterday when I was placing flowers on the unmarked graves." "Not since then." The sheriff's tone was suspicious. "No, sir." "Is he in some kind of trouble?" "He's wanted for questioning about a disturbance at the White Elephant this afternoon. My brother thinks he might have stolen something as well." Nate silently cursed. It was a transparent excuse to arrest him, but it would be enough in a town where the Blackfields held sway. "I haven't seen him," Deanna replied smoothly. "But if he comes to the clinic, I'll be sure to send word." "You do that. And Miss Dawson, Tucker's dangerous. Killed 4 men once already. You'd best keep your distance if you spot him." "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff." The door closed, and Nate slipped away into the darkness, making his way out of town via back alleys and shadows. He spent the night in his hidden camp, alert for any sound that might indicate pursuers. Morning brought no visitors, but Nate remained cautious. He used the time to clean his weapons and plan his next moves. If Jerome Blackfield was indeed behind his brother's death, confronting him directly would be suicide. He needed evidence, something that would stand up even in a town where the Blackfields controlled the law. At midday, he approached the mission ruins carefully, scouting the area before revealing himself. The stone walls of the old Spanish mission stood like broken teeth against the sky, abandoned decades ago but still imposing in their decay. Diana was already there, sitting on a fallen column with a small basket beside her. She wore a riding habit and had arrived on horseback, her mare tethered nearby. "You weren't followed?" Nate asked, emerging from the scrub brush. "I'm quite certain," she replied. "I took a roundabout route and doubled back twice." Nate raised an eyebrow, impressed by her caution. "You've done this sort of thing before," a fleeting smile crossed her face. "Not exactly, but I've read enough dime novels to know the principles." Despite the gravity of the situation, Nate found himself smiling back. "What did you find out from Lillian Moore?" Deanna opened her basket and withdrew a notebook. Mrs. Moore was reluctant to discuss her guests at first, but when I mentioned I was researching the history of Abilene for a ladies' literary society project, she became more forthcoming. She flipped through several pages. Fordham stayed at the boarding house for exactly 3 weeks. He registered as a mining surveyor from Denver but received no mail during his stay. He paid in advance with gold coins, unusual for a surveyor who would typically be paid by bank draft. Did she mention any visitors? Better than that. She keeps a visitor log for security purposes. Deanna's eyes gleamed with triumph. 2 nights before your expedition left, Jerome Blackfield visited Fordham's room and stayed for over an hour. The next morning, Fordham checked out, saying he was heading north to survey a potential claim. "North," Nate repeated, "but he told us the silver was east in the territory near the Brazos." "Exactly." Deanna closed her notebook. "There's more. I spoke with Gus Dawkins this morning as well. He remembered that Fordham's horse had Texas brands, not Colorado ones. He thought it odd but didn't mention it at the time." Nate paced the ruins, processing this information. So Fordham wasn't from Denver, met privately with Jerome Blackfield, then lied about where he was going. He stopped and faced Deanna. "It's compelling, but not enough to prove Jerome orchestrated the ambush. What about the silver samples? Where would Jerome get high-grade ore to plant?" Nate considered this. "There's a silver mine near El Paso that Jerome might have connections to. His family has interests all over the state. We need to find Fordham," Deanna said decisively. "If he was working for Jerome, he might be willing to testify against him, especially if he was coerced." "Assuming he's still alive," Nate said grimly. "Men like Jerome don't leave loose ends." Deanna stood, brushing dust from her riding skirt. "There's one person who might know where to find Fordham. Gretchen Willis at the White Elephant. She was close to Fordham during his stay, according to Mrs. Moore's gossip." Nate shook his head. "The saloon's too dangerous for me right now. Jerome's men will be watching for me." "Then I'll go," Deanna said simply. "Absolutely not. A respectable woman like you can't just walk into a saloon and start questioning one of the girls." Deanna raised an eyebrow. "I already did yesterday, didn't I? Besides, I have a legitimate reason. Gretchen visits the clinic monthly for medicine for her cough. I can tell the bartender I have an urgent delivery for her." Nate studied her determined face and realized arguing would be futile. "If you do this, you need to be careful. Don't mention my name or anything about the ambush. Just try to find out if she knows where Fordham might have gone after leaving Abilene." "I understand." Deanna gathered her belongings. "I'll do it tonight, when the saloon is busy and Jerome is likely to be occupied with his business affairs. Meet me back here tomorrow morning," Nate instructed. "And Deanna," he stopped, Surprised at his use of her given name, she looked up at him, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Yes, thank you. Not many would risk helping a man the whole town calls a liar. Perhaps I'm a better judge of character than the whole town." Her eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary before she turned and walked to her horse. Nate watched her ride away, conflicted. Deanna Dawson was risking her reputation and possibly her safety to help him find justice for his brother. The depth of her commitment to a virtual stranger both perplexed and moved him. More troubling was his growing awareness of her as a woman, her intelligence, her courage, the graceful way she sat her horse as she disappeared over the rise. Such thoughts were dangerous. Once he found out what happened to Sam, he'd have to leave Abilene. A man with his reputation had no place in a respectable woman's life. The evening hours passed with excruciating slowness as Nate waited at his camp, wondering if Deanna was safe. The moon was high when he heard approaching hoofbeats too fast for a casual rider. He melted into the shadows, rifle ready. "Nate," Deanna's urgent whisper carried through the darkness. "Are you here?" He emerged cautiously. "What's wrong? You weren't supposed to come until morning." She dismounted quickly, her face pale in the moonlight. "We have to leave. Now. Jerome's men are searching for you outside of town. They know you've been camping near the creek." "How did they find out?" "I don't know, but they're combing the area in groups of 3. I overheard them at the saloon." She was already untying his bedroll. "There's an abandoned line shack about 5 miles west that Gretchen told me about. We can hide there tonight." Nate questioned, even as he quickly packed his few belongings. "I can't go back to town tonight. One of Jerome's men saw me leaving the saloon in a hurry. He'll be suspicious." She handed him his saddlebags. "Besides, I found out something important. Fordham is alive, or was a year ago. Gretchen received a letter from him postmarked from a town called Sentinel in the Arizona Territory." Nate secured his gear to his horse and mounted. "That's a long way from here." Apparently, he promised to send for her once he was safe from Blackfield. Deanna swung into her own saddle with practiced ease. "He was running from Jerome, Nate. That confirms our suspicions." They rode west under the cover of darkness, keeping to less traveled paths and speaking little. The line shack appeared after an hour's ride, a small wooden structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. It was simple but solid, with a stone fireplace and a single room that had once housed cowboys working the range. Nate checked the interior while Deanna tended to the horses. Finding it empty of everything except dust and a few pieces of broken furniture, he cleared the hearth and started a small fire, careful to keep it low enough that the smoke wouldn't be visible from a distance. Diana joined him inside, carrying her saddlebags. "It's not much, but it will keep us hidden until we decide our next move." The intimacy of the situation suddenly struck Nate. They were alone, miles from town, in a one-room shack with a single pallet of straw that served as a bed. The firelight cast a warm glow on Deanna's face, highlighting the curves of her cheeks and the tendrils of hair that had escaped her pins during their ride. "You should take the bed," he said gruffly, turning away to busy himself with his gear. "I'll keep watch from the doorway." "Don't be ridiculous. There's room for both of us to rest." She began unpacking provisions from her bag. "I brought food from the clinic: bread, cheese, and some dried beef." They shared the simple meal in silence, the weight of their situation hanging between them. Finally, Deanna spoke. "Gretchen told me something else. Before Fordham left Abilene, he gave her a small leather pouch for safekeeping, said if anything happened to him, she should open it." Nate looked up sharply. "Did she?" After a year with no word, yes. It contained a hand-drawn map and a letter. Deanna leaned forward. The map showed the location of the ambush site, with X's marking where each man fell. The letter confessed that Fordham had been hired by Jerome Blackfield to lead you and the others to that specific location. "Where's this letter now?" Nate's heart raced. Deanna's expression fell. "That's the problem. Gretchen showed it to a friend who apparently mentioned it to the wrong person. 3 days later, her room was ransacked and the letter stolen." She was so frightened she considered leaving town, but Jerome offered her protection and a better position at the saloon. Bought her silence, Nate said bitterly. So the only evidence is gone, not entirely. Gretchen memorized parts of the letter, including Fordham's claim that Jerome wanted your brother dead, because Sam had discovered evidence of Jerome's involvement in land fraud forging deeds to properties where the owners had died or left the territory. Nate stood abruptly, pacing the small room. Sam was a surveyor. He would have noticed discrepancies in property lines or ownership. He ran a hand through his hair. The week before we left, he was working on maps of the county land registry, said something about irregularities he needed to report. That could be motive for murder, Deanna said quietly. Land speculation is big business with the railroad's expansion. Nate stopped pacing, a new thought occurring to him. If Sam documented these irregularities, those papers might still exist somewhere. Would he have kept them at his home? Sam lived above the surveyor's office. After he died, I didn't have the heart to go through his things. The new surveyor probably cleared everything out. Nate frowned, trying to remember details from that painful time. Wait, Sam had a lockbox at the bank. I never claimed it after he died. I left town too quickly. Deanna's eyes widened. It could still be there. Banks hold unclaimed property for years. I can't exactly walk into the Abilene bank and trust and ask for it, Nate said dryly. Not with the sheriff looking for me. No, but I can, Deanna countered. As his only surviving relative, you can write a letter authorizing me to claim it on your behalf. With my standing in the community, they're unlikely to question it. Nate studied her face, illuminated by the firelight. Why are you doing all this? Risking everything to help me. Deanna was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to her hands. When I first came to Abilene, I was running from something too. My father was ruined by a powerful man back east who forged documents to steal his medical practice. No one would believe us against this man's word. She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Father died of a heart attack 6 months later. I know what it's like to lose someone you love to a lie and have no recourse to justice. Without thinking, Nate moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. I'm sorry about your father. She squeezed his hand gently. When I heard about you in town, the liar, the coward who got his brother killed, something didn't sit right. The way people spoke of it seemed too neat, too simple. Then when I saw you at the cemetery, grieving your brother after 3 years. She shook her head. I knew there was more to the story. Still, you've put yourself at considerable risk for a stranger. Are you still a stranger, Nathaniel Tucker? She looked at him directly, her voice soft. I feel I've come to know you better in these few days than people I've worked alongside for years. The air between them seemed to grow thicker. Nate was acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth of her hand in his, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. Deanna, he began, not entirely sure what he meant to say. She silenced him by reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his cheek. You don't have to say anything. I know this can't last. Once we find the truth, you'll move on. It's what men like you do. Men like me. Men who have been hurt by the world, who don't believe they deserve peace. Her eyes were wise beyond her years. I understand it better than you might think. Before he could respond, she stood and moved to the pallet. We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day if we're to retrieve that lockbox. Nate remained by the fire, watching as she settled herself on one side of the pallet, leaving space for him. After a moment's hesitation, he joined her, keeping a respectful distance between them. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him, his mind racing with thoughts of Jerome Blackfield, his brother's murder, and the woman lying beside him who had inexplicably become his ally in the search for truth. Just before dawn, he drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to be awakened abruptly by Deanna's hand on his arm. Riders, she whispered. Nate was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle. He moved silently to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. 3 men on horseback were approaching from the east, moving slowly, scanning the ground. Jerome's men, he murmured. They must have followed our trail. Deanna quickly gathered their belongings. There's a back window. If we move now, we can reach the horses and escape through the ravine behind the shack. Nate nodded, impressed again by her quick thinking. They slipped out the rear window as the riders approached the front door. By the time the men discovered the shack was recently occupied, Nate and Deanna were already racing away through the rocky terrain, where their tracks would be harder to follow. They rode hard for an hour, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. When they finally stopped to rest the horses by a small stream, Deanna pulled a map from her saddlebag. There's a settlement about 10 miles north of here, too small to be called a town, but they have a telegraph office. I can send a message to Dr. Thompson explaining my absence and ask him to go to the bank for the lockbox. It's too risky, Nate objected. Jerome might be monitoring the telegraph office in Abilene. Not if I use a code Dr. Thompson and I established for emergencies. She smiled at Nate's surprised expression. During the war, he worked with the Union to smuggle medical supplies across enemy lines. He taught me a few tricks. You continue to amaze me, Miss Dawson, her smile deepened. Good, I'd hate to become predictable. They reached the settlement by mid-morning, just a collection of buildings serving the surrounding ranches. Deanna sent her telegraph while Nate waited out of sight, then rejoined him with news. Dr. Thompson will retrieve the lockbox and meet us tomorrow at noon at his brother's farm, 20 miles north of Abilene. It's isolated and safe. And if Jerome's men follow him, he'll take precautions. Besides, he has no reason to suspect the doctor is helping us. As far as anyone knows, I've simply taken a few days to visit a sick relative. They spent the day traveling north, keeping to less traveled routes and remaining vigilant for signs of pursuit. By nightfall, they had covered 15 miles and made camp in a sheltered grove of cottonwoods beside a small creek. As Deanna prepared a simple meal from their provisions, Nate built a small fire, screened by rocks to minimize its visibility. The domesticity of the scene struck him as they sat together, eating in companionable silence under the star-filled Texas sky. If we find proof in Sam's lockbox, Deanna said eventually, what will you do? Nate poked at the fire with a stick. Take it to the county judge in Fort Worth. He's outside the Blackfield's influence and has a reputation for honesty. And after that, will you stay in Texas? He hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know, haven't had a proper home since I left Abilene. Deanna was quiet for a moment. You could come back, you know. Once your name is cleared. The idea was more appealing than it should have been. Not much for me here anymore. Isn't there? Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Nate looked up to find her watching him, her face illuminated by the firelight, her expression open and hopeful. Something shifted in his chest, a loosening of the tight coil of guilt and bitterness he'd carried for 3 years. Maybe there could be, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty, if certain things were different, such as clearing my name, finding justice for Sam. He paused, finding a reason to stay. Deanna held his gaze steadily. And if you found such a reason, the question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Before Nate could answer, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their camp. In one fluid motion, Nate doused the fire and drew his pistol, signaling Deanna to remain still. They listened, barely breathing, as the sounds of movement came from the trees to their west. Show yourself, Nate called, positioning himself between Deanna and the potential threat. Don't shoot, Mr. Tucker, came a familiar voice. It's Gus Dawkins. The livery stable owner emerged from the trees, hands raised. Behind him came another figure. Nate recognized the aging Dr. Thompson, looking travel-worn but determined. Ezekiel, Deanna stood in surprise. You weren't supposed to meet us until tomorrow. Plans changed, the doctor said grimly. Jerome Blackfield came to the clinic asking about you, Deanna. He seemed very interested in your sudden departure. When I received your telegram, I knew we had to move quickly. Did you get the lockbox? Nate asked. Dawkins produced a small metal box from his saddlebag. Got it right here. Wasn't easy, had to convince the bank manager I was acting on behalf of the doctor who was acting on behalf of you. He handed the box to Nate. But I've done business with Abernathy for years. He trusted me enough to let it go. Nate stared at the box, his heart racing. Inside might be the evidence needed to prove his brother was murdered and clear his own name. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the lock. "We need the key," he said. "Sam always wore it on a chain around his neck," Dawkins said quietly. The implication was clear: the key had been buried with his brother. Nate closed his eyes briefly, remembering the simple funeral, his brother's body lowered into the Texas soil while townspeople watched with suspicious eyes. "We'll have to break it open," Dr. Thompson said practically. "But not here, we're too exposed." "My brother's farm is still too far," Deanna said. "Is there somewhere closer we can go?" Dawkins nodded. "I know an old hunter's cabin about 3 miles north. Used it myself during deer season last year. Should be secure enough for our purposes." They saddled up quickly and rode through the darkness, the metal box secure in Nate's saddlebag. The cabin Dawkins led them to was small but sturdy, with thick wooden shutters and a hidden location among a stand of oak trees. Once inside, Dr. Thompson produced a set of medical tools from his bag. These might help with the lock. It took nearly half an hour of careful manipulation, but eventually the lock gave way. Nate lifted the lid with reverent hands, as if opening his brother's grave. Inside were several folded documents, a small leather journal, and a pocket watch that Nate recognized as having belonged to their father. He removed the papers first, unfolding them carefully on the cabin's rough wooden table. "Land surveys," he murmured, examining the first document. "These are copies of county records with Sam's notations." Deanna leaned over his shoulder, her breath warm against his cheek as she studied the papers. "Look here," she said, pointing to markings in the margins. "He's highlighted boundary changes and noted dates. Dr." Thompson adjusted his spectacles as he examined the documents. These properties all changed hands within months of their original owners' deaths or departures, and the new owner in each case. "Jerome Blackfield," Nate finished, spotting the name repeated across multiple deeds. "Or one of his business associates," Dawkins whistled low. "Sam was building a case against him for land fraud." "There's more," Deanna said, opening the journal. "Daily entries documenting conversations, suspicious activities." She flipped through the pages, then stopped abruptly. "Here the day before you left for the silver claim. Sam wrote that he confronted Jerome about the land discrepancies." Nate took the journal from her, reading his brother's neat handwriting. "Met JB today regarding inconsistencies in the Farley and Wilson properties. He denied knowledge but seemed nervous. Offered me a considerable sum to forget my concerns. When I refused, his manner turned threatening. Said I should be careful about poking into matters that don't concern me. We'll take evidence to county judge next week after returning from expedition with Nate." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. "He needed to eliminate Sam before he could take the evidence to a judge," Nate said quietly. "The silver strike was just a convenient lure to get him into Comanche territory. And the others were collateral damage," Deanna finished softly. "But why not just ambush Sam alone?" Dr. Thompson asked. "Why involve you and the others at all?" "Because a Comanche attack on a group of prospectors would raise fewer questions than the murder of the county surveyor," Dawkins said grimly. "It would look like bad luck, not assassination." Nate continued reading through the journal, each entry further documenting Jerome's land-grabbing scheme. The final entry, dated the night before their departure, sent a chill down his spine. "Nate is excited about the expedition. I haven't told him my suspicions about Fordham. Something doesn't feel right, but I have no proof the man isn't legitimate. If my instincts are wrong, I don't want to dash Nate's hopes. If they're right, well, 4 armed men should be able to handle any trouble." Guilt and grief washed over him anew. If Sam had shared his suspicions, perhaps they could have been more cautious, better prepared. "This is enough, Doctor," Thompson said firmly. These documents prove Jerome's fraud and establish clear motive for your brother's murder. But not that he orchestrated it, Nate pointed out. For that we need Fordham, or another witness, Deanna said thoughtfully. Gretchen might be willing to testify about the letter she received, especially if she knows Jerome no longer has power over her. It's risky, Dawkins warned. Jerome won't go down without a fight. He has too much to lose. We need to get these documents to Fort Worth, Nate decided. Tonight. Before Jerome realizes what we've found. I'll go, Dawkins volunteered. No one's looking for me. I can be in Fort Worth by tomorrow night if I ride hard and catch the morning train from the junction. Nate hesitated, then nodded. Take everything except the journal. I want to read the rest of it. As Dawkins prepared to depart, Dr. Thompson pulled Deanna aside. Nate couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the concern on the older man's face and Deanna's firm, reassuring responses. After Dawkins left, carrying the precious documents, Dr. Thompson announced he would return to Abilene. My absence will be noticed if I'm gone too long. Besides, I can keep an eye on Jerome's movements and send word if he seems suspicious. Be careful, Deanna urged. He's dangerous. I've dealt with dangerous men before, my dear. The doctor's eyes twinkled. During the war, I once performed surgery on a Confederate general while Union troops searched the town. I think I can manage Jerome Blackfield. With the doctor gone, Nate and Deanna were alone again in the small cabin. The emotional weight of the day's discoveries left them both quiet as they prepared for sleep. You should take the bed, Nate said, nodding toward the cabin's single cot. There you go again, being noble, Deanna replied with a small smile. The floor is cold and we're both adults. I think we can share the cot without compromising my virtue. Heat rose in Nate's face, but he couldn't deny the logic of her suggestion. The cot was narrow but could accommodate them both if they lay close together. As they settled onto the thin mattress, Deanna's back against his chest, Nate was acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. She fit against him as if made to be there, her breathing gradually slowing as she drifted toward sleep. Nate, she murmured, her voice thick with approaching slumber. If we succeed, if your name is cleared, what will you do then? He was silent for a long moment, considering his answer. For 3 years, he'd lived without a future, focused only on surviving each day and outrunning his past. The possibility of a life after vengeance was almost too fragile to contemplate. I don't know, he admitted finally. Find somewhere to put down roots, maybe, start over. In Abilene. Her question was soft, tentative. Nate's arm tightened slightly around her waist. Depends on what's there for me. She turned in his arms to face him, their faces inches apart in the darkness. What if there was someone who believed in you? Someone who saw the truth when others only saw lies? The vulnerability in her voice undid him. Nate brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. That would be a powerful reason to stay. Diana's lips met his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with shared longing. When they finally parted, breathless, Nate rested his forehead against hers. This is madness, he whispered. We barely know each other. Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't had time to understand, she replied. I've never felt more certain of anything than I am of you, Nathaniel Tucker. They held each other through the night, talking softly of their pasts, their hopes, the fragile dream of a future together once justice was served. Dawn found them still entwined, having crossed a boundary that neither regretted. As morning light filtered through the cabin's shutters, a distant sound alerted Nate hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. He was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. Get dressed quickly, he told Deanna, who was already pulling on her boots. We need to move. They were barely ready when the first shot splintered the cabin door. Nate pushed Deanna toward the back window. Go, he urged. I'll hold them off. I won't leave you, she insisted. Deanna, please, I can't lose you too. The urgency in his voice must have convinced her, for she nodded reluctantly. I'll circle around to the horses. Be ready to run. She slipped through the window as Nate took up position by the door. He counted at least 4 men from the sound of their movements. Jerome must have somehow tracked them to the cabin. Perhaps they'd been followed from town after all. "Tucker," a voice called Sheriff Blackfield, not his brother. "Come out with your hands up. You're surrounded." Nate remained silent, conserving ammunition as he planned his escape route. He needed to buy time for Deanna to reach the horses. "We know you're in there with the Dawson woman," the sheriff continued. "Don't make this worse for yourself or her." A shot rang out from the far side of the cabin, not aimed at Nate, but away from the building. Deanna must have encountered resistance near the horses. Fear and rage propelled Nate through the door, firing as he moved, forcing the sheriff and his men to duck for cover. He sprinted toward the sound of the earlier shot, staying low and using the trees for protection. He found Deanna crouched behind a fallen log, exchanging fire with a deputy positioned near their tethered horses. "Are you hit?" he asked frantically, sliding in beside her. "No, but they have us pinned down." Her face was dirt-streaked but determined as she reloaded the small derringer she carried. "There are 6 of them, Nate. Too many." Nate assessed their situation grimly. The deputy guarding the horses was their immediate problem, but the others would soon circle around behind them. "Their position was untenable. When I give the signal, run for the horses," he said. "I'll cover you. That's suicide." "Not if we're smart." He gestured to a stand of trees to their right. "I'll draw their fire toward those trees, then circle back. You make for the horses from here. The angle should give you enough cover." Deanna looked unconvinced but nodded. "On your signal." Nate kissed her quickly, fiercely. "Be ready." He darted out from behind the log, firing toward the deputy and then sprinting for the trees he'd indicated. As expected, the man's attention followed him. Bullets splintering bark where Nate had been moments before. From his new position, Nate could see the sheriff and his other men converging on the cabin, their backs to Deanna's position. He fired twice over their heads, causing them to whirl and return fire in his direction. Deanna seized the opportunity, running low and fast toward the horses. She had nearly reached them when the deputy spotted her movement and turned to fire. Nate's shot rang out first, striking the man in the shoulder. He fell with a cry as Deanna reached the horses, quickly untying them both. Mounting quickly, she guided the second horse toward Nate's position, staying low in the saddle as bullets whizzed past. Nate burst from the trees, running in a zigzag pattern toward her. He caught the reins of his horse and swung into the saddle in one fluid motion, and they were galloping away, bending low to present smaller targets. The sheriff and his remaining men gave chase, but their horses had been picketed farther away, giving Nate and Deanna a critical head start. They rode hard across the open country, heading northeast, away from both Abilene and the road to Fort Worth. After an hour of hard riding, when no pursuit was visible on the horizon, they slowed to rest the horses beside a small stream. Deanna dismounted shakily, the adrenaline of their escape beginning to wear off. "Are you all right?" Nate asked, helping her down. She nodded, though her face was pale. "That was not like the dime novels." Despite everything, he laughed. "No, it's considerably less romantic in reality." Deanna splashed water on her face, her hands steadier now. "They know about the lockbox. They must have followed Dr. Thompson or Dawkins." "Or Jerome has spies in the bank," Nate agreed grimly. "Either way, we can't go back to Abilene." "What about the documents if they caught Dawkins?" "He had a good head start. With luck, he's already reached the junction and caught the train." Nate scanned the horizon. "We should keep moving. Head for Fort Worth ourselves. Even if Dawkins made it, the judge will want our testimony." They traveled cautiously, avoiding main roads and settlements, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 40 miles and found shelter in an abandoned trapper's hut near a small river. As they prepared a cold meal, not daring to risk a fire, Deanna suddenly laughed, the sound incongruous after their day of tension and flight. "What's funny?" Nate asked, puzzled. Just thinking about what Dr. Thompson would say if he could see his respectable assistant now on the run with a notorious outlaw shooting at the sheriff. Her smile was rueful. Not exactly the life I imagined when I came to Abilene. I'm sorry I dragged you into this, Nate said seriously. You deserved better. Deanna moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. Don't apologize for bringing me the most exciting and meaningful days of my life. For the first time since my father died, I feel alive, really alive, even with people shooting at you. Well, perhaps that part could be less frequent. She squeezed his hand. But being with you, fighting for justice, knowing that what we do matters, I wouldn't trade it. Nate studied her face in the dim light filtering through the hut's single window. When this is over, if we survive it, I want to court you properly. No running, no hiding, no bullets. Just a man calling on a woman he admires more than anyone he's ever known. Deanna's smile was radiant. I'd like that very much, Mr. Tucker. They reached Fort Worth late the following day, exhausted but determined. The county courthouse was imposing, a stone building that represented the law Jerome Blackfield had flouted for years. To their immense relief, they found Gus Dawkins waiting for them on the courthouse steps, looking tired but triumphant. You made it, he exclaimed. We've been worried sick since we got word of the shooting at the cabin. We had a close call, Nate acknowledged. The documents. Safe with Judge Harmon, he's been reviewing them since yesterday evening. Dawkins lowered his voice, and there's more. Fordham is here. Nate and Deanna exchanged shocked glances. Here in Fort Worth? Deanna asked. Dawkins nodded. After I delivered the documents, I sent telegrams to every sheriff and marshal in Arizona Territory, asking about Ellis Fordham. Got lucky the marshal in Tucson knew of him and forwarded my message. Fordham arrived this morning by stage, looking nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Is he willing to testify against Jerome? Nate pressed. More than willing. Says he's been running scared for 3 years, changing his name, moving from town to town. When he heard someone was finally building a case against Blackfield, he couldn't get here fast enough. Dawkins grinned. Turns out he's got a powerful conscience for a hired gun, been eating him alive. What happened to your brother and the others? Judge Harmon, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair and piercing eyes, listened intently as Nate, Deanna, and Fordham presented their evidence. Sam's journal and land surveys provided documentation of Jerome's fraud, while Fordham's testimony detailed how he had been coerced into leading the expedition to a predetermined location where Comanche raiders paid by Jerome would attack. Blackfield had me over a barrel, Fordham explained, his face haggard with guilt. I'd worked for him before, nothing violent, just scouting properties, carrying messages. Then he caught me skimming money, threatened to have me hanged unless I did this one last job. He looked directly at Nate. I told myself they'd just rob you all, take your horses and gear. I didn't know he'd ordered them to leave no survivors. Yet you ran instead of reporting the crime, the judge observed. I was scared. When Tucker survived, I knew Blackfield would blame me. I took what money I had and headed west. Fordham's hands twisted nervously. I've been living under assumed names ever since, always looking over my shoulder. Judge Harmon took extensive notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they had finished presenting their case, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. This is the most comprehensive evidence of corruption I've seen in 20 years on the bench, he said finally. I'm issuing warrants immediately for Jerome Blackfield and all associated parties, including Sheriff Morris Blackfield, for obstruction of justice. He turned to Nate. Mr. Tucker, consider your name cleared. I'll issue a formal statement exonerating you of any wrongdoing in the deaths of your brother and his companions. Relief washed over Nate in a dizzying wave. 3 years of being hunted, of carrying the weight of suspicion and guilt, ended with those simple words. Deanna's hand found his, squeezing tightly. What happens now? She asked the judge. I'm sending U.S. marshals to Abilene to arrest the Blackfields. Given their influence in the town, I want federal authority behind this arrest." Judge Harmon looked at Nate. "I'd advise you to remain in Fort Worth until the situation is resolved. Your testimony will be needed for the trial." Nate nodded. "We'll stay." 2 weeks later, Nate stood on the platform of the Fort Worth train station, waiting for the westbound train to Abilene. Beside him, Deanna looked nervous but determined. "Are you sure about this?" he asked her. "Returning to Abilene, Dr. Thompson needs me," she replied, "and I left rather abruptly. I should at least pack my belongings properly." The trial was still pending, but the initial hearings had sent shockwaves through Texas. Jerome Blackfield, his brother, and 3 associates had been arrested and held without bail. Their operation had extended beyond land fraud to include extortion, bribery of officials, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was overwhelming, with more witnesses coming forward daily now that the Blackfields' power was broken. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and cinders, passengers disembarking before the new travelers could board. As they waited, Nate noticed Deanna watching a young mother with 2 small children step onto the platform. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. Deanna smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "About the future, possibilities." Nate's heart swelled with an emotion he'd almost forgotten hope. "I like possibilities. Even the possibility of staying in Abilene after everything that happened there." He considered the question seriously. "It was Sam's home. It could be ours too in time. And your wandering heart, will it be content to stay in one place?" Nate took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "My heart isn't wandering anymore. It's found where it belongs." The conductor called for boarding. As they found their seats, Nate thought about the journey ahead, not just the train ride, but the life waiting to unfold. There would be a trial to endure, a town's perception to change, a relationship to build properly with the respect Deanna deserved. But for the first time in 3 years, the future seemed like a promise rather than a threat. The truth had set him free, just as Sam would have wanted. As the train pulled away from Fort Worth, Deanna rested her head on his shoulder, her presence solid and real beside him. Nate watched the landscape roll by, Texas spread out before them like the blank pages of a book waiting to be written. "Tell me a truth," Deanna said suddenly, looking up at him with those wise, beautiful eyes. Nate smiled, understanding her request. After so many lies and half-truths, she wanted something real, something that was theirs alone. "I love you," he said simply. "That's the truest thing I know." Her answering smile was like sunrise after the darkest night. "And I love you, Nathaniel Tucker." No matter what lies behind us or ahead of us, that truth will remain. The train sped westward toward Abilene, carrying them home. The return to Abilene was both easier and harder than Nate had anticipated. The town had changed in the weeks since they'd fled the Blackfields' arrest, had created a power vacuum that was slowly being filled by more honest men. The new acting sheriff, a former deputy who'd chafed under Morris Blackfield's corrupt leadership, greeted them with cautious respect. Some townsfolk still regarded Nate with suspicion, old beliefs dying hard. But others, those who had suffered under the Blackfields' reign, nodded in acknowledgement or even stopped to shake his hand. Dr. Thompson welcomed Deanna back with open arms and no recriminations. "You did what was right," he told her. "I couldn't be prouder if you were my own daughter." Nate took a room at the hotel while he considered his next steps. Sam's house and office had long since been occupied by the new surveyor, but Nate found himself drawn to a small property on the outskirts of town, a modest house with good bones and a few acres of land, enough for a garden and some horses. "It needs work," the agent warned as Nate inspected the sagging porch and weather-beaten exterior. "I'm not afraid of work," Nate replied, already envisioning what it could become with time and care. He visited Deanna at the clinic every day, sometimes bringing wildflowers or small gifts, courting her with the formal propriety she deserved. They dined together at the hotel restaurant, walked through town in the evenings, and slowly, deliberately built something neither had expected to find. The trial was scheduled for spring, still months away. In the meantime, life settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly like normalcy. Nate found work with Gus Dawkins at the livery, his knowledge of horses proving valuable. The physical labor of rebuilding his house filled his days, while his evenings belonged to Deanna. On a crisp November afternoon, 6 months after they had fled the cabin under gunfire, Nate led Deanna up the newly repaired steps of the little house. The exterior was freshly painted a warm cream color, the windows gleaming with new glass. "It's finished," he said proudly, opening the door. "At least the important parts are." Deanna stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the polished wooden floors, the simple but well-crafted furniture, the curtains hanging at the windows. "Nate, it's beautiful." She moved through the front room to the kitchen, running her hand appreciatively over the solid table. "When did you find time to do all this?" "I had help. Dawkins is handy with carpentry and some of the other men pitched in." He watched her explore, nervous energy making him shift from foot to foot. "Do you like it?" Deanna turned to him, her smile radiant. "I love it, it's perfect." "It could be ours," he said, the words rushing out before he lost his courage. "If you do me the honor of becoming my wife," her smile faltered, surprise replacing it. "Nate." He crossed to her quickly, taking her hands in his. "I know it's soon. I know there's still the trial ahead, but I also know I love you, Deanna Dawson. I want to build a life with you right here if you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile returned brighter than before. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Nathaniel Tucker." He kissed her then, his heart so full he thought it might burst. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "It was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small pearl. "Sam kept it safe all these years." Deanna extended her trembling hand, and Nate slipped the ring onto her finger. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like coming full circle, your past becoming our future." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the local church. Dr. Thompson gave Deanna away, beaming with paternal pride. Gus Dawkins stood as Nate's best man. The gathering was modest, a few townspeople who had come to accept Nate, some of Deanna's patients who adored their kind-hearted nurse, and even Ellis Fordham, who had settled temporarily in Fort Worth while awaiting the trial. As winter settled over Abilene, Nate and Deanna built their life together in the little house on the outskirts of town. Deanna continued her work at the clinic, while Nate divided his time between the livery stable and additional improvements to their home. They visited Sam's grave together on Christmas Day, placing a wreath of evergreens against his headstone. "He would have liked you," Nate told Deanna as they stood hand in hand in the quiet cemetery. "He always said I needed someone sensible to balance my impulsive nature." Deanna smiled. "From his journal, I feel I know him a little. He was a good man, principled like his brother." "Better than his brother," Nate corrected gently, "but I'm trying to live up to his example." "You already have," she assured him, squeezing his hand. Spring brought the trial in Fort Worth, a tense affair that dragged on for weeks. Nate and Deanna both testified, along with Fordham, Dawkins, Dr. Thompson, and a parade of witnesses who had suffered under the Blackfield's criminal enterprises. Jerome Blackfield maintained his innocence to the end, his face a mask of indignant righteousness even as the evidence mounted against him. His brother, the former sheriff, broke under cross-examination, confessing to his role in covering up his brother's crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence. When the verdict was finally delivered guilty on all counts, Nate felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, vindication, and a curious emptiness. No judgment could bring Sam back or restore the years lost to running and hiding. "It's over," Deanna said as they left the courthouse for the last time. "We can go home now, home." The word still held wonder for Nate, who had gone so long without one. As summer bloomed across the Texas landscape, life in Abilene settled into a peaceful rhythm. The scandal of the Blackfields faded into town history, replaced by more immediate concerns. A new railroad spur being built, the summer heat, the price of cattle. Diana continued her work at the clinic, increasingly taking on responsibilities as Dr. Thompson's health began to decline. Nate, with his name fully cleared and his reputation rebuilt, was approached by the town council about becoming a deputy under the new sheriff. "Me? A lawman?" he'd asked incredulously when the offer was made. "You've proven your integrity," Councilman Watts had replied. "And you know firsthand how important honest law enforcement is. We need men like you, Tucker." After discussing it with Deanna, Nate accepted the position. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man once labeled an outlaw now wearing a badge, but there was satisfaction in upholding the law Sam had believed in. On a warm evening in late August, as they sat on their front porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass, Deanna took Nate's hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "I saw Dr. Thompson today," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "Not as his assistant, but as his patient." Nate's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you?" She nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. "We're going to have a baby, Nate, in early spring." He gathered her into his arms, overwhelmed by the miracle of it, a child new life emerging from the ashes of so much loss and pain. A future neither of them had dared imagine just a year ago. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you." The baby, a boy they named Samuel Ezekiel Tucker, was born on a perfect April morning, arriving with a lusty cry that Nate swore could be heard all the way to Fort Worth. He had Deanna's hazel eyes and what promised to be Nate's determined chin. "He's perfect," Deanna murmured, exhausted but radiant as she cradled their son. "Look what we made, Nate." Nate, who had faced Comanche raiders, corrupt lawmen, and gunfights without flinching, found himself utterly undone by the tiny fingers that wrapped around his rough index finger. "Hello, little Samuel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got quite a legacy to live up to, named after two of the finest men I've ever known." Dr. Thompson, now semi-retired but still active in the community, became a doting honorary grandfather, bringing gifts and medical advice in equal measure. He insisted on checking the baby weekly, pronouncing him the most perfect specimen of infant health I've encountered in 40 years of practice. Life settled into a new pattern, now centered around Samuel's needs and schedule. Deanna continued to assist at the clinic a few days a week, taking the baby with her. Nate juggled his duties as deputy with the responsibilities of fatherhood, sometimes walking his rounds with Samuel strapped to his chest in a sling Deanna had fashioned. The town grew and prospered. New families arrived, bringing fresh energy and ideas. Abilene was changing, the lawless frontier town gradually giving way to a more settled community. On Samuel's first birthday, they held a small celebration at their home, which had expanded to include a new nursery and a larger kitchen. Gus Dawkins came bearing a hand-carved rocking horse, while Dr. Thompson brought a child-sized medical bag, to start his training early. After the guests had gone and Samuel was sleeping soundly in his crib, Nate and Deanna sat together on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the sun set over their land. "I never thought I'd have this," Nate confessed quietly. "A home, a family, peace. For so long, all I had was guilt and vengeance." Deanna leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "And now I have everything." He kissed the top of her head, because one remarkable woman believed a liar might have truth worth hearing. "The best decision I ever made," she replied, smiling up at him, demanding the truth from a handsome, troubled cowboy in a cemetery. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, Nate held his wife close, grateful beyond words for the journey that had brought them here, from lies to truth, from vengeance to justice, from solitude to love. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, building their life one honest day at a time in the town that had once rejected him but now felt, irrevocably, like home.